Welcome to Paranormal Pages. Please drop a like or comment if you want to help the channel. Now let's get into the true scary stories. The laughter beneath the window. It began with a soft, innocent giggle. I heard it as I sat in my worn-out armchair, staring blankly at the flickering television in the living room. The laugh, at first, sounded distant and delicate, like the kind you'd expect from children playing on a sunny afternoon. A normal sound, comforting even, as if life existed outside my lonely house. But the clock on the wall glowed with the harsh truth. 3:07 a.m. I muted the TV, leaning forward, straining to hear. More laughter followed, louder this time, but still playful, almost like a game of tag. My skin prickled as unease settled over me. No one in this neighborhood had kids that age, certainly not at this hour. I walked over to the window, hesitant but curious, peering through the curtains into the dimly lit street. The street lamps bathed the road in a weak, sickly light, casting long shadows of gnarled trees and abandoned cars. But what struck me most was the complete and utter emptiness. No children. No movement. Just silence, heavy and pressing against the glass like an invisible weight. Maybe I'm just hearing things, I muttered, trying to calm myself, but deep down, the explanation felt thin. My heart began to beat faster as I backed away from the window, but the laughter echoed again, closer this time, as if just beneath the window ledge. I couldn't resist anymore. Grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, I opened the front door and stepped outside, the cool autumn air biting at my skin. As soon as my feet hit the porch, the laughter stopped. Complete silence. I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, as though 1,000 unseen eyes were trained on me. The wind picked up, rustling the fallen leaves on the ground, but there was no sign of anyone, child or otherwise. I stood there, feeling the pressure of the night creep into my bones, and then, faintly at first, I heard it again. This time the laughter wasn't playful. It was low, sinister, and distorted, as though the children's voices had been stretched and warped by something not quite human. The sound wrapped around me like a cold breath on my neck. "Who's out there?" I shouted into the darkness, my voice trembling more than I wanted it to. No response. Only silence and the feeling of being surrounded by something just out of sight. The kind of thing you can't explain, but you feel in your gut. Suddenly, a shape darted across the street, a small shadow, no taller than a child. I froze, heart hammering. It moved unnaturally, too fast and too fluid, almost as if it wasn't touching the ground at all. I aimed the flashlight toward it, but all I could see was the empty street. Then, just as quickly, the laughter returned, now directly behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, only the sound of the door creaking shut behind me. I stumbled backward into the house, slamming the door shut behind me. My chest tightened as I locked the deadbolt, feeling the cool metal beneath my trembling hands. The flashlight dropped to the floor, rolling in slow circles before coming to a stop. The laughter had ceased, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just beyond the door, waiting, watching. As I stood in the middle of my living room, trying to catch my breath, I heard it again, but not outside this time. It was coming from the hallway, deeper inside my house. A faint giggle, almost like an echo, bounced off the walls. My blood turned to ice. I hadn't checked the back door. I hadn't locked it. I reached for the kitchen drawer, fumbling for something, anything that could give me a sense of control. My fingers wrapped around the cold handle of a knife. Slowly, cautiously, I crept toward the hallway, the blade trembling in my hand. The hallway stretched out before me, darker than usual, as though the shadows had thickened into something tangible. At the far end was the door to my bedroom, where the laughter now seemed to drift from. I swallowed hard, gripping the knife tighter. My mind raced with questions. Who, or what, could have gotten in? How? I didn't want to believe what my instincts were screaming at me, that this was no child. This was something far worse. Something playing a twisted game. The door to my bedroom creaked open slowly, and the light from the hallway illuminated just enough for me to see the edges of the bed. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my ears, each footstep echoing like a drumbeat. And then I saw it. A small figure stood at the foot of my bed, back turned to me. It looked like a child, no more than 5 or 6 years old, with dark, matted hair and clothes that seemed old, frayed at the edges. But there was something wrong. The figure was too still, too quiet, despite the low giggle that continued to fill the room. "Who are you?" My voice was barely a whisper. The figure didn't move. Slowly, almost painfully, it began to turn, and as it did, the laughter grew louder, distorted and wrong. When it finally faced me, I could feel the bile rise in my throat. Its face was not that of a child. Hollow eyes stared back at me, dark, endless pits that reflected no light. Its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, too wide, stretching unnaturally across its face, revealing teeth that were sharp, pointed. Teeth that were too many. It took a step toward me, and the laughter, the awful, gut-wrenching laughter, became deafening, filling the room like a swarm of locusts. I staggered backward, the knife slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. My legs felt like jelly as I turned and ran, slamming the door shut behind me. I raced down the hallway, my mind spinning, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The thing behind me was not a child. It was something far worse, something ancient and evil. As I reached the living room, the sound of footsteps, small, rapid footsteps, echoed down the hallway, chasing me. I glanced back just in time to see the figure emerging from the darkness, moving unnaturally fast, its face still twisted in that awful grin. It stopped just at the edge of the living room, standing there, watching me, giggling. I backed away, tripping over the corner of the coffee table. My phone. I needed to call someone, anyone. I grabbed it from the couch, my fingers fumbling as I dialed. But as soon as the phone reached my ear, I heard the laughter again, louder than ever, this time, from the phone itself. The laughter through the phone was maddening, a twisted parody of innocence that crawled into my mind like nails scratching against glass. I hurled the phone across the room, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The creature, no, the thing, stood at the entrance to the hallway, its head tilted unnaturally to one side, as if curious. The grotesque grin stretched wider, revealing more of those jagged teeth, its hollow eyes fixed on me. I backed away, my legs trembling, unsure of where to go. The door was just behind me, but somehow I knew that leaving the house wouldn't solve anything. Whatever this was, it wasn't confined to my home. It had come for me. And it wouldn't stop. The laughter subsided, replaced by a low, almost guttural whisper that seemed to rise from the walls themselves. "Do you hear them?" The voice asked, though it wasn't coming from the thing in the hallway. No, this voice was all around me. "Do you hear the children?" I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to scream. "What are you? What do you want from me?" My voice cracked, sounding weak, desperate. The thing didn't answer. Instead, it took another step forward, its small feet dragging across the floor, the sound unnervingly loud in the suffocating silence. The whispers grew louder, rising like a crescendo, surrounding me from every corner of the room. I could barely make out the words, but they were there, hissing just beneath the surface of the laughter. "Come outside. We're waiting." I shook my head, closing my eyes tight, hoping this was some sick nightmare I could wake from. But the cold air brushed against my skin, chilling me to the core. My eyes flew open, and I saw it. Outside the window, under the flickering street lamp, more figures stood. At least 4, maybe 5. Small, childlike, but wrong, so horribly wrong. Their limbs were twisted, their heads jerking unnaturally as if their bodies didn't belong to them. They stood in a circle, swaying gently as their hollow eyes turned toward me. Watching. Waiting. The whispers urged me forward. "Come. Play." I backed away from the window, my heart pounding so hard I thought my chest might explode. "This isn't real," I whispered to myself, though every inch of my body screamed otherwise. The thing in the hallway moved closer, inch by inch, its twisted smile never fading. The figures outside swayed in unison, as though connected by an unseen force. My back hit the far wall, and I realized I had nowhere else to go. The figures outside began to laugh again, soft at first, but it grew and grew until the sound filled my head like a chorus of demonic children. The thing in the hallway was only a few steps away now, the air around it growing colder with each passing second. And then, as if it had been waiting for this moment, it spoke. Its voice was a rasp, low and hollow, like wind through a cracked window. "You called us. We heard you. I never called anyone, I stammered, tears welling up in my eyes. I didn't. Yes, you did, it interrupted, its voice slithering into my mind like ice. Every night. You listen for us. You watch. You wonder. Now we've come. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. It was true. Ever since I had first heard that laughter weeks ago, I had been fixated, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I stayed up late, listening, waiting, always curious, always drawn to the sound. And now they had come. Because I had let them in. I dropped to the floor, pressing my hands against my ears to block out the voices, the laughter, the whispers, but it was no use. They were inside my head, filling every corner of my mind with their twisted games, their endless laughter. The thing in the hallway took another step, its shadow falling over me like a shroud. Then, in a moment of horrifying clarity, I understood. The figures outside weren't here to kill me. They were here to take me. The laughter grew louder as the thing reached out, its cold, bony fingers brushing against my face. The voices whispered again, this time softer, like a secret being passed through the dark. Come. Join us. I bolted upright, heart pounding, as the thing's icy fingers touched my skin. Every instinct screamed for me to run, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by terror. The figures outside the window swayed faster now, their grotesque bodies moving in sync with the growing chorus of whispers. The thing in front of me, with its too wide grin and hollow eyes, leaned closer, its breath cold against my face. Join us, it whispered, its voice layered with the laughter of children that had haunted me for nights on end. My chest tightened as I realized what it was offering, or rather, what it was demanding. It wasn't here to kill me. It wanted something far worse. I had to move. I had to get out. My limbs felt sluggish, like they were being pulled down by an invisible force, but somehow I managed to force my body into motion. I stumbled backward, pushing myself off the floor and toward the front door. The figures outside began to laugh again, but it was a low, mocking sound now, as if they knew there was no escape. Just as I reached the door, a loud bang reverberated through the house. My head whipped around. The thing in the hallway was still there, but its form was different now, shifting, elongating. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, its head tilting to an impossible angle as it grinned wider, teeth glistening in the faint light. The whispers intensified, filling the room, pressing against my skull like a vice. You can't leave, it rasped, the laughter rising again. You invited us in. With a surge of desperation, I yanked the door open and bolted outside. The cold air hit me like a wall, but it wasn't the crisp, autumn chill I had expected. No, this air was wrong, thick, suffocating, as if the night itself was alive and watching. I stumbled down the porch steps, my feet crunching on the dry leaves, the laughter of the figures behind me echoing louder with each step. I didn't know where to go. I just needed to run, to get away from this nightmare. The street stretched out in front of me, bathed in the pale, flickering glow of the streetlights. But something was different. The houses, my neighbors' homes, looked warped, twisted, as if they'd been melted and reshaped by something unseen. The figures were moving now, gliding toward me without ever lifting their feet. They hovered just above the ground, their hollow eyes fixed on me, their mouths open wide in that same horrifying grin. Behind them, the thing from my hallway emerged from the shadows, its body bending in impossible ways, its limbs dragging across the ground as it followed. I ran faster, my lungs burning with each breath, but no matter how far I got, they were always just behind me. Their voices echoed in my head, a chorus of whispers that I couldn't escape. Come play. Stay with us. Forever. Suddenly, I felt a hand, cold, skeletal, wrap around my wrist, yanking me backward. I screamed, trying to pull free, but the grip tightened, pulling me down onto the street. I looked up, and there it was. The thing. Its face hovered inches from mine, its dark, empty eyes staring deep into me. You are ours now, it hissed, its voice scraping against my eardrums like nails on a chalkboard. I kicked and thrashed, but the figures surrounded me, their hands reaching out, their touch freezing my skin. And then, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of children laughing, echoing through the night. But this time, the laughter wasn't distant. It wasn't outside the window. It was coming from inside me. My vision blurred, the edges of my world darkening as the thing leaned closer, its grin stretching wider. "Don't fight it," it whispered, its voice soft and soothing, almost comforting. "You belong with us now." The last thing I saw before everything went black was my own reflection in its hollow eyes, twisted, distorted, and grinning back at me. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 2. The Silent Shadow. It all started the night I installed the nightlight. A small comfort, or so I thought, a warm, soft glow to ease the unease that had been creeping into my nights. Lately, sleep had been a fragile thing, shattered by the smallest creak or groan of the house. I told myself it was just the new environment, new house, new sounds. The nightlight was supposed to be my defense against that irrational fear, that childhood terror of the unknown, of what lurks in the dark corners of your room when your eyes are closed. The first few nights were uneventful. The little light by the door cast a reassuring glow, pushing back the darkness just enough to let me rest. But then, around the fourth night, I noticed something strange. From the edge of my vision, as I lay in bed, I saw it, a shadow, just where the light didn't quite reach. At first, I thought it was a trick of the eyes, something easily explained by the odd angles of light in the room. But the shadow, it didn't move when the light flickered or when I shifted. It was still, as if it had been waiting. I convinced myself it was nothing. After all, the mind plays tricks, especially in the dark. But that night, as I drifted into sleep, I could feel something, a presence, lurking in that corner. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and though I was wrapped tightly in my blanket, a chill ran through me. My breath caught, and I opened my eyes, expecting to see. What? I wasn't sure. But the shadow was still there, darker than before, like it was watching me. I sat up in bed, staring at the corner, trying to focus on it, to convince myself it wasn't real. "It's just the light," I whispered aloud, hoping the sound of my voice would make it feel less real. But it didn't. The shadow remained, unmoving, a stark contrast to the warm glow of the nightlight. My throat felt tight, my heart pounding, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. Then, the light flickered, just for a second, and the shadow seemed to shift. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It was there, standing tall, like a figure made of pure darkness. I froze, gripping the edge of my blanket as if it could protect me. I wanted to call out, to scream, but something in my gut told me not to. It felt as if making any sound would draw its attention, as if it was aware of me, but not yet fully focused. The silence stretched, my pulse loud in my ears. Finally, I forced myself to lie back down, pulling the covers up to my chin, keeping my eyes on that corner until exhaustion eventually dragged me under. But sleep didn't bring peace. I dreamt of cold hands gripping my ankles, pulling me into the dark, where no light could reach. The next morning, I tried to laugh it off. Bad dreams. A trick of the mind, nothing more. But the memory of the shadow stuck with me, lurking in the back of my thoughts as I went about my day. I kept telling myself it was just stress, that moving into a new house had unsettled me more than I realized. But deep down, I knew something was off. It was the stillness, the weight of that shadow, how it felt more real than any nightmare I'd ever had. By the time night fell again, I was dreading going to bed. I found myself staring at the nightlight in the hallway before turning it on, questioning whether it was really helping. The thought of sleeping in total darkness made my skin crawl, but now the light seemed like it was revealing something worse. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the switch, before finally flipping it on. The soft glow once again lit the room, casting long, familiar shadows against the walls. I climbed into bed, my body tense, every nerve on edge as I lay down. For the first few minutes, nothing seemed unusual. But then, I glanced toward the corner, and my blood ran cold. The shadow was back. It wasn't quite as large as before, but it stood there, just where the light didn't touch, like a person lingering just out of sight. My heart began to race, my mind scrambling for an explanation that would make sense. But there was none. For what felt like hours, I lay there, watching it. And then, something happened that sent a chill straight through me. A faint sound, barely audible, like a whisper brushing past my ear. I sat up, looking around the room, trying to pinpoint the source. The whisper came again, clearer this time, though I couldn't make out the words. It was as if someone was speaking right next to me, just at the edge of my hearing. "Who's there?" I whispered into the dark, my voice trembling. The room was silent again. The whispering stopped, but the shadow remained. It was almost like it was listening, waiting for something. I swallowed hard, gripping the blanket tighter. "This isn't real," I muttered to myself. But it was hard to believe that when every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that faint whisper, growing louder, coming from the corner where the shadow stood. At one point, I could swear I saw the shape shift, like it was moving, leaning forward slightly. I turned on the lamp by my bed, flooding the room with light, and for a moment, the shadow was gone. But as soon as I switched off the lamp, it reappeared, as if waiting patiently for its moment. I spent the rest of the night staring at it, my heart pounding in my chest. It was no longer just a shadow. I knew that now. It was something else, something that didn't belong here. And the worst part? I had no idea what it wanted, or how to make it go away. By the third night, my nerves were frayed. The lack of sleep was gnawing at me, making my thoughts muddled and heavy, but I couldn't shake the dread that coiled in my stomach. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow, lingering, watching. The whispering had started earlier now, just as the sun began to set. It followed me from room to room, faint at first, like someone murmuring just behind me, then growing louder when I turned off the lights. My skin prickled every time the sun dipped below the horizon, and I knew, without a doubt, that whatever it was growing bolder. I tried to ignore it. I kept telling myself it was all in my head. I even called a friend to stay over, though I couldn't bring myself to tell her why. New house, new sounds. "It's just a bit creepy at night, that's all," I said with a weak laugh, masking the panic rising inside me. She stayed with me that evening, but as midnight crept closer, she noticed something strange. "Hey," she said suddenly, her voice uncertain. Is that your reflection?" I froze, following her gaze. The large mirror on the wall reflected most of the room, casting back the soft glow of the nightlight. But there, in the reflection, something wasn't right. In the corner where the shadow usually stood, there was a figure, tall, thin, and featureless, standing just beyond the reach of the light. My heart dropped into my stomach. "That's impossible," I whispered. I couldn't see it directly, but there it was, clear as day in the mirror. "Turn on the light," I urged, trying to keep my voice steady. She did, and just like before, the figure vanished. In the light, it was gone, as if it had never been there at all. We both stared at the empty corner, and I could see the confusion and unease growing in her eyes. But she shrugged it off, laughing nervously. "We're scaring ourselves for no reason." "Must be a weird reflection," she said, trying to shake off the tension. But I knew better. After she left, I was alone with it again. The reflection had shown me something. It wasn't just a shadow. It had shape now, a form. I knew I should leave the house, pack a bag and run, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I needed to understand what this thing was, what it wanted. As the hours passed, I sat in bed, staring into the mirror, waiting for it to reappear. Around 2 a.m., it did. The reflection showed the figure again, clearer this time. Its arms were long, unnaturally so, and it was moving, slowly, like it was reaching for something. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't just standing in the corner anymore. It was inching toward the bed, its movements slow but deliberate, as though it was testing how close it could come without being noticed. I wanted to scream, but my throat tightened. Instead, I watched, helpless, as it stretched its dark limbs closer and closer, its fingers brushing the edge of the bed frame in the reflection. I couldn't see it in real life, but the mirror showed everything. Suddenly, the nightlight flickered. The figure in the reflection jerked, turning as if it had sensed me watching. And then, for the first time, I heard a clear voice, a low growl that sent a wave of dread through me. "Come closer." The words scraped against the inside of my skull like nails on a chalkboard. I stumbled backward, knocking over the lamp as I scrambled to turn it on. The room flooded with light, and just like before, the shadow vanished. But the feeling didn't go away. It was still there, waiting in the dark corners, just beyond the light. And now, it knew I was aware of it. I didn't sleep the fourth night. The house felt wrong, infected with something I couldn't escape. The whispers were louder now, persistent, echoing in every room I walked into. They slithered through the walls, making the air feel thick and heavy. It wasn't just in the night anymore. The presence had seeped into the daylight, clinging to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. Every corner I passed, every reflection I caught in a mirror, I expected to see it, waiting for me. Watching. Desperation clawed at me, and I started to do something I never thought I would: research. I scoured the internet for any clue, any mention of shadows moving in the light, of reflections that showed more than reality. Most of what I found were ramblings of paranormal enthusiasts, but one story stood out. A user had written about a similar experience, a shadow figure only visible in reflections, growing stronger with each night. They called it the lurker. The post went on to explain that the lurker fed on fear, growing bolder as its victim became more aware of it. The more attention I gave it, the stronger it became. And once it crossed the threshold, once it reached the bed or touched me, there would be no escape. The post ended with a chilling line: "Whatever you do, don't let the lights go out." That night, I surrounded myself with light. Every lamp in the house was on, flooding every inch of my room. I even set up candles by the door, their small flickering flames offering the last line of defense. It was ridiculous. I knew it looked absurd, but I didn't care. As long as the lights were on, it couldn't reach me. But as the night wore on, my confidence began to wane. The air felt colder, the room quieter than it should have been. The whispers were gone, but the silence felt worse somehow, like the calm before the storm. My eyes were drawn to the corner where the shadow usually stood, and despite the flood of light, I swore I saw something dark lurking just out of reach. At 3 a.m., the power went out. Panic shot through me like ice water. The lamps blinked off, the candles casting long, eerie shadows across the room. In the dim flicker of flame, I saw it again, the shadow, standing in the corner, but this time it was moving, gliding slowly toward me. Its limbs were grotesquely long, stretching across the room as it approached. The candles flickered wildly, as if something was sucking the air from the room. I scrambled for my phone, the small glow of the screen the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. My hands shook as I tried to turn on the flashlight, but the phone slipped from my fingers, clattering to the floor. And then, the last candle went out. In the total darkness, I felt it, cold fingers brushing against my arm. I recoiled, stumbling backward, my heart hammering in my chest. The air felt thick, suffocating, as the presence loomed closer. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. It was right in front of me. Suddenly, a voice, low, guttural, and too close, whispered in my ear. "You can't hide from the dark." My scream tore through the silence, but there was no one to hear it. The shadow had me now, and the last thing I saw before everything went black was the nightlight flickering weakly, then dying completely. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 3. The Inheritance. When the box arrived at my doorstep, I knew it was trouble. My grandmother's death had been expected. She was old, frail, and distant, but what I hadn't anticipated was the strange inheritance she had left me. Nestled inside that wooden crate was an antique mirror, tall and thin, framed by black and silver, etched with the faint designs of angels that looked more like creatures of some twisted dream. It was the kind of object that, even untouched, seemed to pulse with an ancient, quiet malice. I lifted it carefully from its straw-filled tomb, setting it against the wall in my living room. The moment I looked into it, a cold dread twisted my gut. I didn't recognize the person staring back at me. Not at first. The reflection was me, of course, my pale skin, my dark eyes, but something was wrong. The eyes looking back at me weren't mine. They were wide, frantic, darting around the room as if searching for something, or someone. My pulse quickened, and I stepped back, but the reflection didn't move with me. It stayed frozen, eyes wide, trapped. Just tired, I muttered to myself, willing my feet to carry me away from the unnerving object. But even as I walked away, I could feel it. Watching. Judging. The air in the room felt heavier now, and I knew I couldn't leave that mirror here without at least covering it. Grabbing an old sheet from the closet, I draped it over the glass, but the fabric didn't offer the comfort I hoped it would. I could still feel the weight of its presence, like something living just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I hadn't heard much from my grandmother in the past few years. After she moved into the old estate house, she became more reclusive, distant even, and her obsession with family artifacts had become increasingly strange. The mirror had been her prized possession. Days passed, but the unease I felt lingered. It got worse when I finally gave in to curiosity and peeled the sheet back one night. I should have left it covered. I don't know what I expected to see, but the vision that awaited me wasn't my own reflection. Instead, I saw a figure, slender, withering, wearing a black gown stained with dirt. Her long, white hair was stringy and matted. Her face was gaunt, pale, eyes sunken into shadowed hollows, lips trembling as she whispered something I couldn't hear. She was standing in a place that looked eerily like my grandmother's estate. For a brief moment, I thought it was my grandmother, but this woman was older, far older, as though the mirror were showing me a nightmare version of her. Then, in a flash, the image vanished. The woman was gone, and my reflection returned, but my heart raced like I had just witnessed something I was never meant to see. The next few nights, I couldn't sleep. The image of that woman, so frail and desperate, haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see her, standing alone in that familiar yet decayed place. The more I tried to shake the memory, the more vivid it became. Eventually, I gave in. I had to know more. I had to understand why my grandmother, who never cared for me, had chosen this mirror as my inheritance. One evening, I found myself drawn to the mirror again. The urge to look was overwhelming, like a compulsion I couldn't resist. This time, as I stood in front of it, the reflection changed almost immediately. The glass shimmered, and once again, I was staring into another moment, another person's life. This time, it wasn't the frail woman. It was a man, a tall, broad figure wearing an old-fashioned suit. His face was twisted in terror, his eyes darting around as if something invisible were hunting him. I watched, frozen, as his lips parted, and he whispered, "It's here. It's always been here." Then, his hands went to his throat, clawing at the air as if something was choking him. His eyes bulged, his body convulsed, and in an instant, his face twisted in agony, contorting into a ghastly expression of pure horror. Just as quickly as he had appeared, the man was gone. My own reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed, trembling. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair in my panic. I felt a cold sweat trickle down my neck. The room was silent, but the oppressive heaviness lingered. What had I just witnessed? Was it a vision of the past? A hallucination? Or something worse? Determined to get answers, I scoured through my grandmother's old letters and journals, hoping to find some clue about the mirror. I found her notes on the mirror in a tattered leather-bound journal hidden away in her old desk. Her writing was frantic, almost paranoid. She described seeing the figures in the glass. She mentioned the woman and the man, both of whom she claimed to have seen many times over the years. But her words hinted at something even darker. My heart pounded as I read the final entry. I was wrong. It doesn't just show their deaths. It shows their last moments because it feeds on them. It traps their souls. Each reflection is a piece of them left behind, waiting to pull you in. I can hear them whispering. I am afraid it's my turn next. I dropped the journal, my hands shaking. Was the mirror cursed? Had it claimed my grandmother in her final days? I glanced over at the mirror, covered once more, but even now, I felt its pull. I couldn't leave it alone, not now that I knew. But as I approached the mirror again, a sudden sound echoed through the room, a soft creak, like someone walking on old floorboards. I froze. The house was empty. Wasn't it? I turned around, my heart pounding in my ears. There was no one there. Just me and the mirror. But in that stillness, I could feel eyes on me. Something cold, something ancient, watching. And this time, I wasn't sure if it was coming from behind me, or from within the glass. The nights began to blur together, a series of sleepless hours spent staring at the mirror, waiting for it to reveal something new, something that might make sense of this madness. The creaks in the house grew louder, the cold more biting. I became convinced that the mirror wasn't just showing me things, It was calling to me. Its pull was like gravity, and every day I found it harder to resist the urge to look, even knowing what I might see. One evening, after hours of pacing the house, I stood before the mirror again, my breath shallow. This time, the reflection didn't wait. The moment I gazed into the glass, I saw them, the man and the woman, standing side by side, their eyes wide with terror, as if they had been waiting for me. The man's hand reached out, trembling, as if trying to touch the glass from the other side. His lips parted, and for the first time, I heard the words clearly, faint as a whisper. "Help us." The woman's face twisted in agony, her hands clutching at her chest as she gasped for breath. Her eyes locked onto mine, pleading. I could feel the terror, the suffocating weight of whatever force was choking the life from them. But I couldn't look away. Their pain held me captive. Suddenly, a third figure appeared behind them, a shadow that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. It was taller than the others, its form obscured by darkness, but its presence was undeniable. The man and the woman turned, their faces frozen in silent screams as the shadowy figure moved closer, its form twisting and warping as though it were made of smoke. I felt its eyes, its unseen, impossible eyes, shift to me. I stumbled back, but the reflection remained, the figures trapped in their eternal torment. My heart pounded in my chest as I slammed the sheet back over the mirror. The whispers didn't stop, though. They grew louder, more insistent. I could still hear their faint cries for help, their desperate pleas for release. I couldn't do this alone. I needed help. I needed someone to believe me. But who would? How could I even explain this without sounding insane? I reached for my phone, fingers trembling, and dialed the only person I could think of, Rachel, my closest friend. She had always been practical, grounded, someone who didn't believe in the supernatural. But maybe, just maybe, she could help me make sense of this. She answered on the second ring. "Hey, you okay? You sound off." I hesitated, the weight of what I was about to say pressing down on me. "Rachel, I need you to come over. There's something strange happening here. It's about a mirror I inherited from my grandmother. I know it sounds crazy, but..." Her tone shifted, concerned but skeptical. "A mirror? What kind of strange, exactly? It shows things, people, their last moments. I know how this sounds, but I've seen it, and I think it's getting worse." My voice cracked, and the desperation in my words must have struck a chord because she sighed softly. "I'll be there in 15 minutes. Just hold on, okay?" The call ended, but the whispers didn't. They swirled around me, growing louder, more desperate. The room felt smaller, the air thick with a suffocating presence. I backed away from the mirror, my back pressed against the wall, trying to drown out the sound of their voices, but they followed me. I didn't know if Rachel would believe me when she arrived, but one thing was certain, the mirror wasn't just a window into the past. It was a prison, and whatever was trapped inside wasn't going to stay there much longer. Rachel arrived within minutes, her face tight with concern as she stepped through the door. The moment she crossed the threshold, the air in the house seemed to shift, as if the oppressive weight of the mirror was acknowledging her presence. She looked around, her brow furrowed. "Okay, I'm here," she said, her voice steady but tinged with doubt. "Show me this mirror." I hesitated, my eyes drifting toward the cupboard frame. The whispers had quieted, but the presence still lingered, heavy and menacing. I swallowed hard, unsure of what would happen once I pulled the sheet away, but I couldn't back out now. She had to see. With trembling hands, I gripped the edge of the sheet and slowly pulled it off. The mirror gleamed darkly in the dim light of the room. At first, the reflection was normal, just us, standing side by side, our eyes wary, searching. But then the surface shimmered, and the familiar transformation began. Rachel stepped forward, her brow knitting deeper. "What the hell?" I watched her reflection as her expression shifted from curiosity to fear. In the glass, the room behind us wasn't the same. It had decayed, crumbling walls, peeling wallpaper, the air thick with dust. And there, behind us, the shadowy figure loomed again, just beyond our reach. "Do you see it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Rachel nodded, her eyes fixed on the mirror, disbelief flooding her face. What is that? Is this some kind of trick? Before I could answer, the shadow moved. It slipped from the background into the reflection of the room we were standing in, its form distorting, as if it was trying to claw its way out of the mirror. Rachel gasped, stumbling backward, but her reflection remained frozen in place, eyes wide, lips parted in a silent scream. I grabbed her arm, pulling her away, but it was too late. The figure in the mirror latched onto her reflection, its smoky tendrils curling around her mirrored throat. I heard Rachel choke, clutching her neck as though she could feel the phantom grip tightening. Panic surged through me. This wasn't just a vision anymore, it was happening, here and now. Rachel! I yelled, shaking her as the mirrored version of her collapsed to the ground, eyes staring lifelessly back at us. But she didn't move. The real Rachel's body twitched violently, her eyes rolling back in her head. I screamed for her to wake up, to break free, but the mirror had her. It had all of them. The glass began to crack. Long, jagged lines snaked across the surface, radiating outward from where the shadow had wrapped itself around Rachel's reflection. The voices swelled in a chaotic crescendo, louder than they had ever been. They weren't whispering anymore, they were screaming, pleading, begging to be let out. In a moment of blind terror, I grabbed the closest object I could find, a small metal candlestick, and hurled it at the mirror with everything I had. The glass shattered, splintering into 1,000 shards that rained down on the floor. The noise was deafening, like the cries of all the souls the mirror had consumed, finally released in a single, ear-piercing wail. And then, silence. Rachel slumped to the ground, her body limp but breathing. I knelt beside her, my heart pounding in my chest as I checked her pulse. She was alive, but unconscious. Relief washed over me, but only for a moment. I glanced at the shards of the mirror scattered across the floor, and my blood ran cold. In each fragment, the reflections were still there, tiny, fractured images of the man, the woman, and countless others I hadn't seen before. Their faces twisted in eternal agony, their eyes locked onto mine. They hadn't been freed. If anything, they were more trapped than ever, their voices silenced but their suffering written into every broken piece. And then, in the largest shard, I saw it, the shadow. It wasn't gone. It was still there, waiting, watching, biding its time. As I stared into the glass, I realized with a sickening dread that it wasn't just Rachel it wanted. It had been waiting for me all along. And now, even though the mirror was broken, the curse was far from over. It was only just beginning. The end. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Thanks for watching.